A Spanish passenger plane crashed on August 20th, 2008, shortly after takeoff from Madrid-Burgos Airport, killing 154 people on board, as well as the crew. At first glance, the reason for this collision appeared to be quite straightforward. But if you look closer, a tale of terrible ironies and coincidences becomes apparent. The collision almost didn't happen at all. This is not a story of a plane going up in flames or a pilot taking off at night and hitting a mountain. This is a complicated account of a crash that nearly didn't occur. This is Spanair Flight 5022's narrative. 166 passengers and 6 crew members boarded Spanair Flight 5022 at Madrid-Burgos Airport in Spain. After a 3-hour ride, they arrived at Gran Canaria Airport in the Canary Islands. On August 20th, 2008, in the afternoon, there were a few people of other nationalities on board, including some Germans, French, Turkish, Italians, and others. But the majority of the passengers were Spanish. Most were vacationers seeking relief from the oppressive summer heat in Madrid. Antonio Garcia Luna, the captain, was a skilled pilot with more than 8,000 flight hours. He was 39 years old. He had previously been a test captain and flight instructor in the Air Force of Spain. He began working for Spanair in 1999 as a first officer, rising to the rank of captain on the MD-80 in 2006. His test results, simulator sessions, and line training records show that he was a better pilot than average. But notes from one training session indicated that he needed to sharpen his crew resource management abilities with a focus on coordination and report building with the other pilot. However, subsequent trainers saw progress in this area. Crew members who had worked with the captain regarded him as someone who strictly followed regulations and was disciplined, exact, and methodical in his work. Francisco Javier Mulet, age 31, was the first officer on this flight. Only the year before, Spanair had employed him, with just 220 hours worked overall. He had flown on the MD-80 for the majority of his little over 1,200 flying hours at the time of the disaster. The first officer was regarded by pilots who flew with him as a series and disciplined pilot who was courteous and tried to work with others. They made special mention of how much he enjoyed flying and how grateful he was to get the opportunity. This flight was conducted on a 15-year-old McDonnell Douglas MD-82 aircraft. Despite being largely retired today, one of the safest passenger aircraft in the sky, the jet was extremely popular with airlines in the US and Europe in the 1990s and early 2000s. This accident is particularly devastating because of how close it was to not happening. The pilots informed the tower controller that they were prepared for departure from runway 36L at a little before 1:30 in the afternoon. The plane said, "Madrid, Spanair 5022, look, we've had a slight problem. We have to exit the runway again," when the controller gave the all clear for takeoff. The pilots made touch with the Palma Maintenance Control Center after the controller gave them the all clear to exit the runway. They discovered that the RAM air temperature probe was giving an unusually high measurement, which was the issue. The air temperature close to the aircraft's surface is measured by this probe. Generally, everything that goes through the air, be it a car, an airplane, or anything else, compresses and heats the air in front of it. When jet planes travel at high speeds, this effect intensifies even more. For instance, this usually results in a temperature increase of 30 degrees Celsius at cruise speed. There are two basic reasons why planes need to measure this temperature. The first is to give pilots the option of turning off the anti-icing heat while in flight. As they fly, all of the air in front of the wings compresses, naturally heating the leading edges of the wings. Because of this, in the event that no icing is predicted, a malfunction in the RAM air temperature sensor is not very significant. But there's another reason airplanes need to know this temperature: the autopilot, more especially the auto throttles. The plane is likely traveling quickly if the RAM air temperature sensor registers a high temperature, which suggests that internal engine damage will result unless engine power is decreased. Put another way, reduced engine throttle during takeoff results from high RAM air temperature. Furthermore, auto throttles are typically utilized in passenger jets during takeoff. This implies that in the event that the sensor is not functioning, takeoffs must be performed manually, given that this sensor is involved in something as important as engine thrust. It is likely that the Spanair pilots were uncertain about whether it was safe to take off with it malfunctioning. They made the decision to go back to the gate and have the system examined as a result. Paradoxically, the RAP probe has a heating element built into it to prevent it from freezing over when attempting to assess the ambient air temperature. In the event that this heating element is activated while the aircraft is stationary, the sensor will inevitably generate an erroneously elevated temperature signal. The captain called the Palma Maintenance Control Center on his cell phone while he was still taxiing. Believing that an unforeseen electrical current was being received by the RAM air temperature probe, the crew was advised by the Maintenance Control Center to reset the Z29 circuit breaker, which provides power to the RAT heating element. Despite the crew's efforts, the probe's temperature did not drop. To have the aircraft inspected by maintenance engineers, the pilots taxi the aircraft back to the gate. The team and the specialists talked over a variety of options, including using dry ice to cool the RAM air temperature probe, in the hopes of lowering its temperature. At this point, the cockpit was bustling with activity as passengers made requests for new air conditioners. Arriving and departing with the crew, the purser, another ship captain flying with the aircraft, and maintenance personnel. The captain acknowledged their lengthy delay and said they needed to record all that had happened. There was increasing pressure in the cockpit to return the aircraft to the runway as soon as feasible. In addition, the aircraft's interior temperature was rising. The outside temperature was 30 degrees centigrade, and the airplane was unable to adequately cool the inside. Both passengers and crew started to become agitated and impatient to go. After attempting to repair the malfunctioning sensor for more than an hour, the engineer suggested that the crew just turn off the circuit breaker to cut off the power to the Ramera temperature probe heater. After the captain gave his approval, the crew started getting ready to leave. Behind the pilots, in the jump seat, a young flight attendant was talking to the first officer about the malfunctioning sensor. The plane was beginning to be refueled in the meantime. The captain got down of the plane just after 2 p.m. to personally supervise the refueling process and make sure everything was moving along swiftly. The pilots had to start this flight from scratch since the jet had come back to the gate and turned off its engines. This required requesting permission to fly to Las Palmas by contacting air traffic control. The first officer had left the last frequency selected on the radio, without getting the cockpit ready for takeoff, so he accidentally called the incorrect controller at first. This reflects the hurried mood that pervaded the cockpit at the moment. This is precisely the kind of unusual circumstance when pilots must follow protocol to the letter. Additional evidence regarding the captain's sense of time constraint during the pilot's review of the before-start checklists can be found in the corporate voice recording. The captain responded to the items on the checklist before the first officer reached the corresponding section, since he knew what they would be before they were read aloud. The captain also gave air traffic control a call before detaxing to find out if they were experiencing any delays. The captain was handling the radios, even though it was the first officer's responsibility. The crew completed the after-start checklist after starting the engines. 8 items were read in all, but before the first officer could finish reading the last one, flaps and slats, the captain interrupted him to order him to contact air traffic control for permission to use a taxi. The last task on the after-start checklist was never completed by the pilots. Although this was an error, there would be other chances for the pilots to set the flaps appropriately before takeoff. The pilots proceeded through the taxi checklist as they began taxiing towards the runway. One of the items on this list required the pilots to check the automatic reserve thrust system's indicator light. In the event of an engine failure during takeoff, additional automatic thrust should be available, as shown by this light being on. But this light doesn't come on if the slats aren't set up for takeoff. In this instance, the pilots were unaware that the light was off. The pilots have one more opportunity to ensure that they haven't raised the flaps for takeoff on this same checklist. The pilots review takeoff speeds, thrusts, and flaps, among other things, during the final item, known as the takeoff briefing. This item had not been completed, according to the voice recorder in the cockpit. While taxiing to the runway, they carried on a conversation with the flight attendant in the jump seat, most of which had nothing to do with the actual flight. Finally, and maybe most perplexingly for the investigators, the first officer performed a last check, called the takeoff impending checklist, as the aircraft aligned with the runway. He was heard checking the LCD screen for the flaps and slats indication, the position of the center of gravity, and the position of the flap wheels. The first officer was heard saying, "Flaps 11," even though the flaps had not been adjusted to that number and should have read 0 on the flap wheel and LCD display. This was captured by the duplicate voice recorder. Later, investigators would come to the conclusion that expectancy bias was at play in this case. The first officer didn't really check his instruments to confirm that the flaps were where he called them to be, since he anticipated them to be there. Humans have an innate tendency to look without seeing, causing us to only see what we anticipate seeing. Furthermore, expectancy bias is more prevalent in situations where psychological factors are unfavorable, as they were in this flight due to the pilot's heavy workload and time constraints. The first officer was intended to be doing these responsibilities while the captain was observing, but since he was lining up at the runway, his attention would have been focused outside the aircraft. Other than the pilots using takeoff thrust, even though the aircraft was not designed for takeoff, there was really nothing that could be done to stop the disaster from this point on. Remark, for instance, that the flaps are not in place. This alarm never went off, for reasons that we'll come back to. The aircraft proceeded normally on the takeoff run, and the first officer launched the aircraft at 157 knots. But as soon as the plane took off, the stick shaker and stall warning system kicked in. The plane pitched upward and banked 32 degrees to the right, barely making it to 40 feet above the runway. At first, the first officer thought there might have been an engine failure and decreased the engine's thrust. But he pressed the throttles to the maximum forward stop right away. But this was ineffective. Then the aircraft started to drop, hitting the ground tail first and slipping along it. It proceeded over an embankment and crashed into the other side, catching fire. From the moment of liftoff to the explosion, a little more than 10 seconds passed. Just 18 of the 172 passengers and crew members on board made it out alive. For 25 years, it was the deadliest aviation mishap in Spain. The Civil Aviation Accident and Incident Inquiry Commission of Spain promptly began an inquiry following the incident. Needless to say, the primary cause of the crash was determined to be the crew's inability to release the flaps. But in terms of the reasons behind this disaster, this is merely the top of the iceberg. There are far more profound explanations for both the disaster and the reason the flaps were never raised in the first place. Recall that the runway was there right before their initial attempt at takeoff at the beginning of this episode. The irony is that with flaps and all, the airplane was fully flyable at this time. Actually, this aircraft had taken off without any problems on several prior flights, even though the RAT sensor had recorded a high temperature. At this point in the flight, the crew's awareness of safety became the factor that ultimately proved to be fatal for them. Being too cautious, they turned back toward the gate, putting themselves under time constraints they couldn't handle. Under the pressure of their constant delay and the heat of the tarmac, their safety-minded mindset vanished. They started to go through checklists quickly, omitting important details and scanning visual checks. They started to gaze, but couldn't see. The distinct positions of first officer and captain started to blur together, making it unclear who was in charge of what. Another irony in this disaster is that the breakdown of the RAM air temperature probe heating system may have contributed to the failure of the takeoff warning system, which was the final line of defense before takeoff. Possible connection to the RAM air temperature probe heating element failure, which forced the aircraft to return to the gate following its initial takeoff attempt. The study found that there was a chance that the electrical relay, which is essential to the functioning of these systems, had malfunctioned. Although this connection between the RAM air temperature probe and the takeoff warning system has been mentioned in other documentaries about this accident, the investigation ultimately found no evidence to support the takeoff warning system's operation on this flight, despite a thorough examination and testing of all pertinent components. It's interesting to note that over a year after the incident, a high RAM air temperature indicator was detected during taxiing by another similar aircraft getting ready to take off from Palma de Mallorca to Barcelona. The two-digit instrument monitor showed a maximum temperature of 99 degrees, which the crew noticed. Recalling the previous year's Spanair crash, they made the decision to test the takeoff warning system. They discovered it was ineffective. After noting the issue in the aircraft's maintenance log, the crew made sure their aircraft was ready for takeoff one last time before deciding to head for Barcelona. According to a report by Boeing, the company was made aware of 6 cases between 2000 and 2008 that airlines had reported. 4 of these cases involved failed takeoff warning system tests and high RAM air temperatures. These cases were resolved by changing the electrical relay that both systems rely on for power. Thus, it is plausible though not definite, that the takeoff warning system on Spanair Flight 5022 malfunctioned due to the same cause as the RAM air temperature heating element. However, the precise mechanism responsible for this failure has never been determined. A number of suggestions were made in the accident's final report to ensure that accidents like this one wouldn't happen again. The report suggested, among other things, that the protocols for MD-80 and related aircraft be changed to require pilots to test the takeoff warning system prior to each flight. Additionally, they suggested that the Federal Aviation Authority and the European Aviation Safety Agency modify the certification standards for aircraft such as the MD-80, such that in the event of a malfunction, the takeoff warning system will give crews a clear warning and cannot be rendered inoperative by a single malfunction. The investigation concluded that the aircraft might have safely ascended away from the runway if the first officer had responded to the stall after takeoff by maintaining the nose below 13 degrees rather than raising it to 18 degrees. Accordingly, the report suggested that takeoff stall recovery be made a requirement of airline pilots' initial and ongoing training programs. Lastly, a number of suggestions were offered regarding crew resource management, since this was a major factor in the Spanair accident. One of the suggestions made was that the European Aviation Safety Agency, or IASA, emphasize the importance of maintaining a sterile cockpit and the negative effects of even small distractions when assessing airline training programs. It should also include accident examples where the absence of a sterile cockpit played a significant role. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep exploring.